All right, so when we're looking at the characteristics of World War One, um, we want to start off by saying like the real surprise in 1914 wasn't that there was an outbreak of war, but it was the nature of the war that unfolded. World War One is was unlike any other previous conflict in its scale, scope, and carnage. We see the new inventions such as the machine guns, velocity rifles, aerial bombings, poison gas delivered by wind and artillery shells, flamethrowers, landmines, long-range artillery, and armored tanks. This changed the nature of warfare and produced the horrific casualties and widespread destruction that we so often associate with World War One and fighting. Total war among industrialized nations meant that everyone was considered a combatant, including civilians. And we see that each side starts to try to starve each other into submission by sealing off foreign trade. This is what's going to get the United States eventually involved in World War One. They often sunk commercial vessels and passenger liners. Intentional destruction extended well beyond the battlefields. Occupied cities, for instance, saw their cultural monuments, cathedrals, museums, historic buildings systematically destroyed at the hands of their enemies. For example, in the first month of fighting, German forces overran a city in Belgium, and when they overran the city, they not only murdered 248 civilians, but also burned down the city's ancient library, and you'll see these actions by the Germans. They'll actually be used as propaganda to not only rouse up public support in Europe, but to entice the Americans to side with the Allied powers to battle back this horrible Hun who knows no limits or bounds to the destruction that they will wreak on people, on children, and on cities alike. On the Eastern Front, Russia intended this war to be one of racial annihilation. Russia used the pretext of war to expel 500,000 Jews and 743,000 Poles. And so each nation is going to be guilty of some sort of atrocity, whether it be on the battlefield or whether it be in occupied cities. And each nation engaged in the war talk that usually touched on the themes of God, duty, sacrifice, patriotism, and honor. But in reality, the arbitrary horrors and wastefulness of World War One involved dishonorable actions and decisions that have yet to be understood, and we cannot forget. I think a great book and/or movie that kind of sums up this war talk would be All Quiet on the Western Front. If you've ever seen that movie, if you've read that book, when the main character Paul and his classmates are in the classroom, and they're being talked to by their teacher, and he's encouraging them to sign up for the army and go do their duty for Germany, and he goes on and talks about German culture, and essentially it's a speech that is full of nationalism, and touches on the themes of duty and sacrifice and patriotism. And I think that's a great example. That scene is a great example of what was going on in countries all over Europe, and what will be going on, in in America, when the government and Woodrow Wilson and George Creel and the like are trying to encourage Americans to sign up for the war and to encourage the war effort. So looking at World War One and the actual fighting, all the sides thought that this would be a war of quick movement. In fact, it began as a war of quick movements, but by shortly after it started, it was bogged down by 1915 into a stalemate, and the stalemate produced not a war of movement, but a war of senseless attrition. And the senseless attrition is going to be punctuated by massive battles that contributed little except more obscene slaughter. For instance, during the Battle of Verdun in northeastern France, this battle of Verdun lasted from February to December of 1916. Some 32 million artillery shells were fired. This means or comes out to 1,500 shells for every square meter of the battlefield. This unprecedented firepower ravaged the landscape. It devastated, shattered villages, and turned farmland and forests into this cratered wasteland. The casualties of Verdun were astounding. The French lost 162,000 soldiers. The Germans lost 143,000 soldiers. And this battle led Charles de Gaulle, a young French lieutenant who's eventually going to become the nation's prime minister, to label World War I, saying that the conflict had become a war of extermination. Most of World War I was fought in the style of trench warfare. And we characterize the fighting in World War I by trench warfare. And this means that most of the battles are not going to be won by skillful maneuvers or by superior leadership, but by brute force. And this is what we mean by, the term industrial war. You're not going to gain ground, but you're going to simply, decimate the other army into a prolonged war of attrition until the manpower and the resources are exhausted. The war on the Western Front, which is, mostly centered in northeastern France, usually involved hundreds of thousands of men crawling out of their muddy dugouts and rat-infested, corpse-crammed trenches. I'm quoting here from a book. After hours of being pummeled by enemy artillery bombardments. In fact, these bombardments, on a side note, 60% of the war's casualties come from shrapnel from this long-distance artillery fire. So the men, as they crawl out of these trenches that are filled with disease, filled with rats and lice, filled with a stench that is unimaginable, as they crawl out of these trenches that are characterized by men losing toes and feet due to trench foot, or developing what is going to be known as trench fever. As they crawl out of these trenches, they had to then cross a blood-soaked no man's land, which is stitched with barbed wire, sown with mines, to engage in what some people consider to be suicidal assaults on a well-defended enemy with machine gun emplacements. And so it's a back and forth affair, World War I is, and you might die in the trenches due to disease and just the horrible living conditions, or as you go across no man's land, you're putting yourself out there with a chance of little to no success, and you have a very good chance of being killed or wounded by the enemy that is sitting there in the trench with a machine gun, and where you can see one man being able to take out thousands of men in just moments. In one attack, for instance, in a battle, the British lost 13,000 men in 3 hours. And this assault only gained them about 100 yards of land. And so, by 1915, this is what World War I has become. And both sides are going to start to look for options to gain their upper hand. And this is going to involve the United States, whether it be at the hands of the Germans in unrestricted submarine warfare, or whether it be at the hands of the British, feeding propaganda to American newspapers about the atrocities that the Germans were committing, or in the form of blood money, where we see the United States bankers, munition makers engage in a fruitful trade with the Allies, but ultimately a trade that is going to lead the United States to eventual war.